Morning.
Good morning, Blaise.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, hello, Tara. How are you?
Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. Thank you so much. Thank you for moderating today this panel.
Of course.
Thank you. How are you, Blaise?
I'm doing well. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Good morning.
Good
Thank
morning.
you. I think you know Bassam Ishaq. We were together in
Yes, of course.
times, yeah. Amberin still is not joining. Not yet.
Well, we're still early. Yeah.
Yeah, is there joining?
And Ms. Ahmed, I have a question. Since you're participating or a part of it, are you going to be also taking questions or sharing any thoughts, or is it mostly the two panelists will speak and you're if there's any questions, should I look to you to answer some of them?
I think only our speakers, only I will be opening this panel today. Then after that, you'll be moderating, and our speakers, Amberin and Blaise, they will talk. Then we will have the question for them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just making sure.
Hear from them. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tara. I sent to Amberin, but I don't. She's asking to send the link to her email. But we have already sent it. Send it.
Hello. Yes, hi. Okay.
From which email you are sending from Syrian Democratic Council? You have her email. Zaman@gmail.com.
The replies for the discussion we might have.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Very good.
Thank you.
Duyuyor saat başlıyor.
She should have it, yes,
Sent.
in her email.
She should, okay. Hello, Amberin. Thank you for joining us. Good to see you.
Yeah, she needs to unmute.
You are muted.
How's that?
Yes, good, thank
Yeah.
you. Good to see you, Amberin.
Good to see you. Thank you so
Hi,
much.
Amberin.
Thank you for
Yeah.
joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting me. Thank you.
Thank you. Still, we have 2 minutes maybe to start.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
So if I could ask, Tara,
Yes.
were you planning to dive in with questions, or did you want us to make opening statements, or how were you thinking of running things?
So I will do a brief introduction of both of you as speakers. And then, Blaise, I'm going to go to you first. And if you don't mind doing a introduction, you can basically dive right. I'm going to introduce your background, and then you're welcome to dive right into, a 10 to 12 minute background to kind of set the stage. And then after that, we'll go to Amberin. And just before we start, just make sure Blaise Miztal and Amberin Zaman, both correct pronunciations or no?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah.
And so, as I explained previously, I've been super busy. I was just come back from Syria and having to write all these pieces. And so I haven't really prepared any remarks. So I'll basically just jump, once Blaise has made his presentation, perhaps, add some thoughts based on, my recent visit there, and perhaps issues that were perhaps left unaddressed, though I'm sure Blaise's presentation will be extremely comprehensive.
I'm sure
Yes,
you can
and also-
cover facts on the ground much better than I can, Amberin, so maybe I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, well, I can just describe what I saw and what I heard, and I think that may add some value.
That's exactly what I want you to do. Since so few people actually get an on the ground view of what's going on, just be a witness. Tell us, describe the scene, your conversation you've seen. You do that beautifully in your articles, describing the buildings and, access to water.
That's very kind. Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. So do we have a good audience? There are lots of people interested.
Yeah. Yes, we have so far.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you. I think it's time to start now. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of the Syrian Democratic Council mission to the United States, we would like to welcome you all. We welcome the senior Pentagon correspondent, Tara Copp of Defense One, who will be moderating today. And I'll monitor senior correspondent, Amberin Zaman, Vice President for the Policy, Blaise Miztal of the Jewish Institute for the National Security of America, and all the participants today who are joining us. Of course, we are talking today about the threat of Turkey to the region of Northeast Syria and its destabilizing effect on the attempt to bring about the real solution to the Syrian crisis. The Syrian people have a universal desire to peace and to maybe given the opportunity actually to rebuild their country again in a manner that is beneficial to all the Syrian people of all ethnicities and religions and cultures. The continuing Turkish threat to our region, which come either in the drone attack that happened recently, even this month, which being killed, 3 civilians have been killed in Qarashli city, among them one man of 86 years old. And others also by daily shelling to the region, which is frightening the people and the civilian in the region. and again, the renewed invasion that they are always talking about to invade the region again. All these, they are not in the interest of United States. It is against the interest of United States. And also United States, you know, it is a partnership of the SDF and the administration in the region. And all these, threat trying to actually stop all the, or this disrupt all the anti-terror campaign and the so-called the Syrian even national army, which is working or armed by Turkey and affiliated by Turkey. They act as the ground forces for the Turkish campaign actually. And most of these people, they are radical, the groups, and they are also malicious and committed a lot of crimes which has been documented. So in order to end this threat to the region and the stability needed, stability in the economy, stability in military, it's needed. But if we want to get this stability, we have to find a solution for the Syrian crisis. So what kind of solution we will be only find? It is by de-escalation, not by threatening, and negotiation. The only way is negotiation and de-escalation, not as aggression and threat. This is the only way that we can reach to a solution for Syria crisis. And everybody knows that the SDF and the SDC, the administration, they were ready to negotiate with all the parts in Syria to end the Syria crisis and to bring peace to all the Syrian people. This is what I can say. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I will give the floor to Tara. Thank you, Tara. Thank you so much.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Tara Copp, the Senior Pentagon Correspondent for Defense One, and serving here today as your moderator. As such, I'm just going to go over a few of the ground rules before I introduce our speakers. If you have a question, most importantly, ground rule, just type it into the chat and I will be looking through the questions and asking them of our guests. You don't need to raise your hand, just put it directly into the chat and I'll pick from there. And also for our speakers, don't worry about looking at the questions in the chat. I will go ahead and get those to you. This is on the record, and as such, we'll start with some introductory remarks, probably 10 to 12 minutes in length from both of our guests today. And let me introduce them both to you now. Our first guest, Blaise Miztal, is the Vice President for Policy at GINSA. He has previously served at the Hudson Institute and as the Executive Director of the Task Force on Extremism in Fragile States, a congressionally mandated project that was convened by the U.S. Institute of Peace. He has also served as the director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's National Security Program. Our second guest is Amberin Zaman, who is a senior correspondent reporting from the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe exclusively for Al Monitor. She's been a columnist for Al Monitor for the past 5 years, examining the politics of Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, and writing the daily Briefly Turkey newsletter. Prior to Al Monitor, Zaman covered Turkey, the Kurds, and conflicts in the region for the Washington Post, the Daily Telegraph, the Los Angeles Times, and Voice of America, and recently returned from the region and is here to share her thoughts and what she saw. So with that, I'd like to kick off our discussion first, Blaise, to you on GINSA's recent report, what you found and what you're seeing at the border between Syria and Turkey now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara, and let me thank the SDC for inviting me and convening this important conversation today. It's a great pleasure to be here both with Tara, who's reporting on U.S. defense policy as a must-read, and Amberin, who really brings the details of what is happening on the ground to those of us who are just trying to opine from our armchairs far away here in D.C. So I'll leave it to Amberin to give us much more of the color and the texture of what she saw on her recent trip into Syria. I'll try to focus sort of at a higher level and maybe more from the perspective of U.S. policy. I think the first thing to note, as Amberin noted in a recent article, is that even though there's this recent mobilization of Turkish forces in near and across the Syrian border that is raising concerns about a ground offensive, there is an ongoing, as Amberin put it, war of attrition against Kurdish groups that spans Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. So the potential for a ground incursion would not be breaking a peace. It would be, in fact, just a further escalation of an already ongoing conflict. And I think one of the important things to note is that increasingly this conflict is being waged from the air, which is a major development in sort of Turkish operational doctrine. We've seen Turkey develop its own drone program, the Bayraktar TB2s, and use them quite effectively in conflicts that it inserted itself into in in Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh in recent years. And we're now seeing those same drones be deployed in Syria and Iraq. And so one of the things that we've been tracking at JINSA is the increase in airstrikes undertaken by Turkey in both Syria and Iraq. And already we've seen that this year in 2021, there have been more strikes, both manned and unmanned strikes, than Turkey conducted in any previous year, all told. So we're seeing an increased tempo of airstrikes. And we're also seeing an increase of politically oppressive action taken against Kurdish groups inside of Turkey. And so we have, I think, sort of a broader constellation of continued Turkish aggression across these three theaters. That's important to note. But the sort of the proximate cause of what we've been monitoring, and I think has alarmed policymakers in Washington more recently, is this mobilization of Turkish forces and Turkish-backed Syrian forces that started in mid-October. On October 10th, Turkey alleged that there was a rocket attack conducted by the YPG, and sort of, as Erdogan put it, he claimed that this was the final straw, and that it required Turkey to go into Syria to solve the YPG threat once and for all, as Erdogan put it. That was followed by the Turkish parliament passing in late October a 2-year extension of its authorization for use of force in Iraq and Syria, again in reference to the YPG threat, as Turkey views it, an extension of the PKK. Since then, we've been seeing Turkish forces, including armor, moving across the border into the buffer zone that was established following Turkey's October 2019 incursion into Syria, as well as Turkey's partner forces, Syrian proxies, moving into areas surrounding sort of northwestern parts of Turkey, of Syria, abutting the Idlib province that Turkey protects already. And so in Turkish press, we've seen reporting of a ground offensive looming that could have 5 potential targets across northeast Syria, from Tal Tamar in the east all the way to Tal Rifat in further west. But so far, we haven't seen those operations taking place. We've sort of seen a bit of a lull, or at least a freeze in the reporting on this in the last 2 or 3 weeks, which I think leads to the question of what Turkey is doing, if this incursion is really imminent, whether this was a ploy of some sorts, or whether Turkey is waiting for other conditions to be in place before it decides to move further into Syria. And I think there's a couple of options that are worth considering here. I think the first and most obvious is that this is closely connected to Turkey's domestic politics, and to the extent that Erdogan is looking for a foreign adventure to rally Turks around the flag, as it were, to boost his flagging popularity, to distract Turks from a worsening economic situation. An operation in Syria might certainly fit the bill, but there's a question of whether this timing is actually politically useful for him, with elections looming, but still some 20 months away, slated for mid 2023. Whatever bounce he might get at home from this operation probably wouldn't survive until those elections happen. And so I think there's a question of, is he going to wait until closer to the election? Is this operation an indication that he might be planning to call elections early? Or does he have something else up his sleeve? But I think those domestic political considerations are always important to take into account with Erdogan. There's also the fact that as much as Erdogan relies on sort of foreign military adventures and sort of stoking nationalist sentiment for his political fortune at home, he also relies on the claim of being a player on the world stage, a force that other major powers respect and have to deal with as well. And so I think that there's a tension here for him between, on the one hand, maybe trying to improve relations with the United States. One thing he's always angling for is an invitation to the White House to appear sort of on the grandest stage of world politics, to show that he's rubbing elbows with the most powerful man in the world, the U.S. president. And so I think he might still be calculating how much pressure does he want to put on, how much risk does he want to have of alienating the U.S. further than he already has with a Syria incursion, versus can he use the threat of this to leverage something he wants out of the United States? And then third, I think there's the consideration of Russia is incredibly important here. It seems unlikely that he would be able to launch a major operation without either having Russian approval or risking some sort of friction with Russian forces that are currently in place in northeast Syria, something that Erdogan has risked before, but seldom profited from. And so I think there's also probably ongoing negotiations between the Russians and the Turks about if there is an operation, what scope of operations the Russians would be willing to permit. And I think that really gets to the broader strategic question here for the United States. Obviously, the U.S. has found a reliable partner in the SDF when it comes to the counter-Daesh campaign, a campaign that still remains important, as we've seen recent attacks increasing by the Islamic State, particularly in Iraq. But really beyond that, it leaves open the question that successive administrations have failed to really answer, which is, what does the United States want to see in northeast Syria? On the one hand, we don't want to see the Islamic State take root or reemerge there. And yet we also don't want to commit any more forces than we already have. Even though, as Tara has reported, we seem willing to keep our 900 troops that are there currently. But we also seem unwilling to fight to keep the region either autonomous from Assad, and yet we've tolerated the presence of Russian troops there on occasion, but we don't want Iran to dominate the region. And so there's really this tension in U.S. policy between what we'd like to see happen in the area and what we're willing to invest resources to accomplish. And I think this leaves us in this sort of very ambiguous position. And I think, it would behoove the United States to be a little clearer about what its objectives for the region and for the area are. Keeping troops in northeast Syria, but purely on a mission to counter ISIS, without taking a stance on either Turkey's role or possible incursion, without any statement of whether we would come to the defense of our partners, the SDF, and without really any further thoughts about whether we want to see the area return to control by the Assad regime, and that meaning the continued presence of Russian and Iranian forces or not, I think creates a lot of ambiguity, which is precisely what Turkey is exploiting. And I think the net result of this is actually going to be probably increased Russian control of this region. We've seen Russia trying to cut deals both with the Turks, but also reportedly with the SDF, saying, why don't you cede us some of the territory you currently have, and in return we'll give you protection or a green light to conduct operations. And so I think this ambiguous U.S. policy is probably going to lead to a further consolidation of Syrian and Russian power in the area. We've already seen it lead to sort of increased Iranian operations, including against U.S. personnel, such as the attack on the U.S. garrison at Tamper several weeks ago. And so I think it's finally time for the U.S. administration to answer what is the policy here. And that means not just answering it in terms of sort of our military presence, but the political outcome that we'd like to see. At the beginning of the Biden administration, then acting Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, Joey Hood, went to Syria and he said, we're going to have this stabilization strategy for Northeast Syria. But a stabilization strategy requires having political and economic elements, not just military elements to your policy. And I think we so far haven't really seen those emerge from Washington. In fact, the only major action that the U.S. has taken in regards to Northeast Syria has been refusing to extend waivers for an American energy firm to develop and export energy from Northeast Syria, which has been economically problematic and does not contribute to the stability of the region. So I think this is, every crisis is an opportunity. So this is an opportunity we now have with this Turkish threat, I think, for the U.S. to clarify its position, which is, I think, probably the best way that we have of trying to push back on the possibility of a Turkish incursion. But I'm happy to leave it there and hear more from Amberin about her trip.
Blaise, thank you very much for setting the scene politically and what's at stake with all of the governments involved here. But Amberin, if you could please paint for us the picture of what it is for people living through this on the ground every day, and even for those of us who have not been to Syria, how are you able to safely travel around and tell these stories? I think that would be fascinating to hear as well. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the SDC for having me here today. And it's wonderful, of course, to be speaking here with Blaise and to have you moderating. So yes, even as Turkey delivers these threats to launch another invasion, it's already, as I noted in those articles that you referenced, in a perpetual state of war against the autonomous administration in Northeast Syria. And this is happening at several levels. First of all, of course, there's the fact that, those borders are very tightly sealed so that, even though Turkey has the opportunity to provide relief to those people living there in very difficult circumstances and obviously compounded by COVID and now this terrible drought, it chooses not to. And so you also obviously have the constant shelling that Blaise mentioned, and it's happening, from various points, but I was in an area, the Habur Valley near Tamper, and there I met lots of people who had to move away from the front lines, where the sort of lines of conflict are drawn between the Turkey-backed rebels and the SDF. People who lived in those regions have all had to flee because of the shelling, getting caught in the crossfire, and now living in villages that were abandoned by Christians in the Habur Valley when ISIS came in. And, everyone I spoke to, and I traveled extensively through northeast Syria. I was in Raqqa, I was in Kamishli, Amude, I was in Hasaka, Dervisiya. In all those places, everybody said they were very nervous about yet another Turkish offensive, because this, to live in that perpetual state of fear is highly destabilizing on so many different levels, because obviously it affects economic life. People aren't willing to, invest in anything. And of course, people fear for their future. They feel fear for their own security. Will they have to, pack up and leave yet again if there's another Turkish offensive, as 200,000 people were forced to do, and now many living in displacement camps. And then, of course, there's the drone attacks that Blaise mentioned. So that's yet another form of it's aggression, and civilians are dying in those drone attacks. So, you asked me how I travel around in that area. When we go to very risky areas, let's say we're going to Raqqa or to Deir ez-Zor, the SDF always insists that journalists, be accompanied by armored SDF vehicle and security guards to protect them. But the way things are today, with Turkey targeting the SDF, you're actually at greater risk traveling in those vehicles because Turkey targets them. So when I was there, when going to these risky areas, the SDF had to provide a sort of van, which they hoped would not attract attention, and obviously provided some security people who were in the van and who were armed, who would, intervene in case we got attacked. So there's the drone strikes, but then, the greatest impact on people's lives is through Turkey's interruption of the water from the Aluk station in Serikanye. So this has been going on since October 2019, when Turkey invaded. They seized control of the station on which 1 million people rely for their potable water. And Turkey has interrupted that flow at least 22 times over the past 2 years. And this is, of course, making life impossible for people. So when I was in Al-Hasaka, which is one of the worst affected cities by these interruptions, people told me that they, in the summer, they did not have water for 2 months, no water, 2 months. And in September, the Russians then intervened and helped broker a new deal under which Turkey now provides 18,000, I think, cubic meters, which is nothing, because apparently the need for that region, I spoke to the head of the water authority there, is 1.2 million cubic meters. And of course, this water is also very important for the camps, the IDP camps, but also the Al-Hol camp, where all the Islamic State families are. And of course, this is happening against the backdrop of the worst drought in the past 70 years that has, crippled agriculture. You have failed crops, farmers who are unable to plant their seeds because they fear that, there's no rainfall, so the crops will fail. So a lot of farmers in debt, selling their gold. This is the marriage season. They're supposed to be buying gold. They're not. They're selling their gold. And of course, all of this creates an environment that is very, very, a very sort of, a great opportunity for the Islamic State to resume its recruiting. And in fact, I haven't yet written that story, but I did meet freshly recruited Islamic State operatives who had been apprehended by the local authorities there, who said they joined simply because, they had no other means of survival, and ISIS was offering them money. And so, in my mind, Blaise was talking about what the United States should be doing. And as General Mazloum in my interview with him underlined, I think the most important issue now at hand is helping redress the, economic problems in the region, because really this is what's creating that ecosystem environment that allows the Islamic State to thrive, and creating obviously the kind of instability that Turkey also takes advantage of, because, you know, it's in addition to the hostile actions, the drones, the shelling, and let's not also forget another thing that Turkey does, international law. It's illegally rendering Syrian citizens of Kurdish origin from the areas that's under its occupation on the grounds that these people collaborated with the autonomous administration. It labels them as terrorists, and this could be somebody who was sort of directing traffic. You know, he worked for the administration's traffic police. That he's labeled a terrorist, rendered to Turkey, captured by the rebels there, the Turkey's proxy forces, handed over to the Turkish military, taken to Turkish cities and prosecuted there as terrorists and given lengthy prison sentences. This is a blatant violation of international laws. And so all of these, as I was saying, the economy is really key, and this is where really to help out the administration there. And the general said, Mazlum said that, you know, one thing that really needed to happen was for that area to be exempted from the Caesar sanctions, for businesses, including in the oil industry and, you know, across the board, to be able to come and invest in the region. Because unless that happens, the situation is just going to go from bad to worse. And so that's one thing that really needs to happen. Insofar as, you know, the political status of that region and the United States providing some, you know, engaging with the SDC and the SDF politically, I think it's de facto doing so anyway. We have Sinam sitting in Washington talking to lots of officials. You have US officials coming back and forth. So informally, that really is happening anyway. And how do you build on that and build on that constructively? That's the conundrum, because unless you bring Turkey on board, it gets extremely difficult. And clearly with this government in power in Turkey now, it's virtually impossible to do that. But I think there is a silver lining, there is a light that we see. And what is that? That's the change in attitude of the main opposition in Turkey. I think it's incredibly significant that for the first time, the main opposition party in Turkey voted against this bill authorizing the deployment, continued presence of Turkish troops inside Syria and Iraq. That's a big, big move for them, because after all, this is the party that was founded by Kemal Atatürk, that sort of embodies all the paranoia about, you know, the Kurds and, you know, minority groups and what have you. It's of course, it says a lot about the shifting dynamics within Turkey itself, where there is, you know, growing recognition that unless you address the Kurds' grievances and you know address you know their needs, you're not going to get elected, because they're a very significant demographic. And we saw that play out in the municipal elections in June 2019 in Turkey, where the Kurds and this main opposition party worked together. And so what's happening inside Turkey today, and as Blaise pointed out, that's kind of where the risk lies for the Northeast, is that Erdogan is getting weaker and weaker, and there's a huge economic crisis, and we're seeing him become more and more erratic. And so nobody can say with any certainty that he would not attack Northeast Syria, if only he sees that as some kind of way of ensuring that he survives, you know, distracting public opinion away from the economic problems, or using that to, you know, postpone the elections, creating some kind of, you know, state of emergency. Who knows? So that risk is always out there. And I think until those dynamics play out until we reach 2023, when the Turkish elections, presidential and parliamentary, are due to take place. I don't think there can be any significant change in the US policy, because I think Blaise, correct me if you're wrong, but I think people in Washington are waiting to see what will happen in Turkey before they make any new attempts, let's say, to bring the Kurds and Turkey to the same table as they've tried in the past. And I think, I guess just one thing that I'd like to add is that Blaise said that the United States should articulate its policy on Syria. I think it's articulated what it's not when it comes to the Syrian Kurds. And this is something that I think has registered, and maybe Sinam would disagree with all the leaders I spoke to in Northeast Syria, is that that the United States is not in the business of nation building or creating a new northern Iraq, if you will. So there is that, and that's why it's a very different situation from Iraqi Kurdistan, and one where obviously, the need to sit down with Damascus is something that needs to be addressed. So I'll leave it there.
Amberin, thank you so much. I do have one follow-up question for you. What were you able to see as far as humanitarian aid getting through? It really strikes me, with that little water being provided compared to the need. How can people survive? You mentioned the farmers selling their gold, but what else did you see for people just trying to get through this?
Well, people are trying to leave in large numbers, and that's another story that I'll be writing about, how people are trying to leave Syria, as they are indeed trying to leave Iraq. And we're seeing that play out in Belarus now, on the Belarus-Polish border. But I'm so glad you asked that question, because, the Russians and the Chinese are blocking the aid corridors to Syria from Iraq and from Jordan. And they're only letting aid go through Turkey to Idlib. And so, of course, aid organizations have a very hard time getting aid. It mostly comes through Iraqi Kurdistan or through the regime-controlled area when it's the United Nations. And the United Nations, of course, is very fearful of offending the regime in Damascus. And this is, of course, having a very negative impact on the autonomous administration's efforts to combat, to deal with COVID. And I spoke to the top health official in the autonomous administration, Dr. Juan, and he painted a very dire picture. Only 1% of the population there has been inoculated because there are no vaccines coming. The regime won't let the vaccines through. The UN isn't really putting much pressure on the regime because they don't want to offend them or have their operations suspended or whatever. And also, I might add, and I hope you speak about this in Washington, is that the coalition promised the Northeast, the autonomous administration, that they would provide vaccines. And so when I interviewed Dr. Juan, I think it was November 3rd or 4th, he said 2 weeks ago he'd spoken to CENTCOM. They'd promised to provide vaccines, but so far they've done nothing. So yeah, it's a very dire situation. And there are only 50 ventilators for a population of 5 million. 50 ventilators. And it costs apparently $50 for every test, to do a test on people. And, that's just a lot of money. And let's not forget that the Syrian pound is has totally collapsed. And people there are just earning a pittance, like $20, $30 if they're lucky, if they have a job. So it's a very, very critical situation. And apparently the Gulf Arab countries are doing nothing either. They talk the talk, but they do nothing.
Well, thank you for that. I will go to a few of our viewer questions first, and then I also have a few questions for both of you as well. One of our listeners has asked, Blaise, I think you might be able to address this. Is the US presence in Northeast Syria dependent or contingent upon the U.S. presence in Iraq. We saw the withdrawal of forces in Afghanistan. The Biden administration is definitely talking to the Iraqi parliament about the future footprint of U.S. forces there. That link is definitely, to be able to provide for the U.S. forces in Syria, you've definitely used Iraqi bases. So what happens if there is a complete drawdown in Iraq? Does it force U.S. forces to also have to leave Syria?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I think the answer in short is yes, with an asterisk. I think that asterisk is the base at Tamper, which is further south and is closer to the Jordan border, and I imagine can be sustained from Jordan. But I think the presence that we have in northeast Syria is very closely linked logistically and operationally to the troops and bases that we use in northern Iraq. So I think without Iraq, it's going to be very hard to maintain that presence in Syria. And I think it is important to note that, I think all the forces that are active across that region took note of what happened in Afghanistan and saw that, under pressure, U.S. forces can be made to leave. To Amberin's point, it became clear what U.S. policy is not, which is not only is it not nation building, but it's not stay in the Middle East. And so I think there's questions now, not just for the Iranians, but maybe for the Turks as well as, and the Russians, can we replicate the conditions that are going to put enough pressure on the United States to get it to leave either Iraq and or Syria? And I think it's very troubling when you see, as we saw in the reporting just yesterday, that Iran decided to send drones to attack a U.S. base at Tamper in retaliation for Israeli strikes because it thought it was safer to attack Americans than to attack Israel. And so, when there's a very explicit calculation going on and an expectation that there's nothing to fear from attacking Americans, then I think we're going to see increased and ramping up aggression. As we saw Iran undertake, in the summer of 2019 and into 2020 against U.S. forces in Iraq. And so all of these are connected in a way where, it might not be Turkish action, but Iranian action in Iraq that causes the U.S. to reconsider its position in Iraq, which affects the position in Syria, which affects Turkey's ability to operate there. And so it really is a very complex and interconnected set of dynamics. But I think assumption that every actor has across the board that with enough pressure the U.S. can be made to fold is going to be dangerous, I think, for the region and lead to more violence, not less.
Thank you. We recently saw reports that State Department, there was a diplomatic visit to Northeast Syria and within this month, but you don't see it discussed at the White House press briefings. You don't see the administration actively talking about what next for Syria. Where's the disconnect, and why do you think there's a reluctance to come forward and say, we are visiting this region and here are the goals that we're trying to pursue?
I know, Amberin, if you have any thoughts, but I'm happy to jump in.
I think you should go first, and maybe I'll add my thoughts.
Yeah, I think officially, at least, the White House has said that they're undergoing a Syria policy review, and so we're waiting for the results of that before anything is announced or any actions are going to be taken. So I think that's the official reason. I think we can speculate on a number of unofficial ones. Certainly not least of those is a broader review that's going on of U.S. force posture globally, but particularly in the Middle East. And I think sort of thinking through just how much skin we want to have in the game there. And I think the reason we're not seeing a lot of statements is because the United States, I think the Biden administration is being very careful to say anything that might commit it to staying longer than it wants to when it's not sure quite how long it wants to stay there. I think there's a couple of other factors that might be at play. One of those I think is sort of the continued attempt by the Biden administration to figure out what sort of political solution it might envision for the autonomous administration. Brett McGurk, who's now the senior director at the NSC, when he was previously in government working on the counter-Daesh coalition, was very much, I think, engaged in trying to negotiate some sort of agreement between the SDF, the SDC, and the Assad regime that would allow for some sort of transition and create the conditions under which US troops could leave. So I think there's an open question to what extent that remains to be sort of his view of what the best approach might be, whether that's shared by others in the administration. And then I think finally, there's sort of continued uncertainty about what our policy should be towards Turkey. And I think Amberin hinted at this. I think there's a couple of different dynamics at play. I think there's different personalities in the administration that have different views toward Turkey, and so there might be some of those internal politics at play. I think there's a general preference not to do or say anything that might seem to be anti-Turkish or try to give Erdogan any further reason to lash out, whether verbally or militarily, against the U.S. Particularly because of this dynamic that Amberin mentioned, where everyone sort of says, well, elections are coming up in 2023. Erdogan's on his back foot. His popularity is sliding. Let's not do anything that might sort of alienate Turks more broadly, or give Erdogan the upper hand here, and let's sort of wait and see what happens. On this point, I'll just point out I actually just published a paper yesterday that was put out by the Hudson Institute. That sort of makes the case that if you look at Turkish opinion polling and where Turks seem to be headed, there's little reason to believe that even if Erdogan were to lose the 2023 elections, which is a big if, what would follow him would be significantly different in terms of foreign policy than what we've seen under Erdogan. So I would challenge some of these assumptions by the U.S. that we can sort of just wait them out, but I'll pause there and curious to hear what Amberin has to say.
Well, I have to say that I slightly disagree with you on the latter. I think if the opposition were to come to power in Turkey, there would definitely be a shift in Turkish foreign policy. It would certainly be less sort of bellicose, for sure. I think there will be a big effort on the part of the foreign policy community, the diplomats who've been sidelined all this time, to sort of bring normalcy to Turkish foreign policy, which has been lacking and is, directed by Erdogan and the few people around him that he listens to, if at all. And I think that in turn will lead to more predictability, which I think is incredibly important. And I think however much you hear all this anti-US rhetoric, I think that the military, for sure, is very concerned about the direction of this relationship, because they recognize how important it is to maintain this relationship with the United States, because that's whose, equipment they rely on. That this is an institutionalized relationship that's, been in place for decades. And yes, we've had a 2-decade-long pause, and things have gone really nuts since Turkey bought these S-400s, but that's not to say that whoever comes after will just continue along that path and, continue to threaten to buy Russian planes or what have you. I'm afraid I have to disagree with you there, Blaise. And the main opposition party has certainly made that very clear. And the people who it's recruited to do foreign policy for them are all very sensible people, former diplomats, former ambassadors, And people, for instance, I can name one who was the former ambassador to London, who was very engaged in rapprochement with Armenia, for instance. These are people with a much more liberal sort of worldview. And so I think that you'll also see Turkey trying to fix its relations with Israel in a much more sort of, in a less sort of transactional way, in a way that will, you know, reflect something of more substance than opportunism in the way that we've seen with Erdogan trying to make nice with the Israelis. Again, I think you'll see much more balance. You may think I'm overly optimistic. I mean, where my pessimism kicks in is whether Erdogan will even allow an election and whether he'll leave peacefully. I think that's a huge question mark. But again, I think just looking at what they did with the authorization, the bill in the parliament for troops in Syria, that already gives us an indication. Of course, that's not to say that the paranoia about Kurdish states on its borders will ever go away. That's sort of a default sort of, it's deeply ingrained in the Turkish psyche, of course. And, you know, we could go on for hours explaining why that is. But setting all of that aside, I think it's terribly important, and I think leaders like General Mazloum appreciate this, that, you know, okay, US support is terribly important and having the troops there is very important. But, you know, when you look at the map, who are your neighbors? And Turkey is your biggest neighbor. And your relationship with Turkey defines your relationship with Iraqi Kurdistan, because Iraqi Kurdistan is in the same position, certainly the KDP, and they need to have a good relationship with Turkey. It's key to their survival, to their economic, and, you know, that's the reality. And so, you know, if you want to be able to keep your channels open with Iraqi Kurdistan, which is the lifeline, you know, you need to sort of balance that. Certainly they need to balance that with their relations with Turkey. So it's key, absolutely key, that at some point this sort of hostility ends, and how we get there is very important. And I think it would be very important, as in fact, I asked General Mazloum, would you be willing to invite members of the main opposition to Rojava, because they had just been to Iraqi Kurdistan, which is another first, a high-level delegation, which included Ünal Çeviköz, the ambassador I was mentioning, who's kind of the shadow foreign minister. I think it's very important to start now to you know, in the same way that the HDP, the largest pro-Kurdish party in Turkey, is building these ties. I think that should be happening at your level too. I think Sinam should be reaching out. I think Ilham should be reaching out to the CHP. It doesn't have to be in public, you know, it doesn't, we don't need to know about it. But I think it's very important that all of these things start happening, and we look beyond Erdogan. Okay, he may put up a fight, it may get really ugly, but in the end, you know, I don't think that he will have the means to hang on in the way that, say, Vladimir Putin does or Chavez does. Turkey is a NATO country. It's a very important country, and it's, you know, sitting on the edge of Europe. It cannot, you know, fail. It would be a disaster for Europe. You know, we wouldn't be talking about Syrians, we'd be talking about Turks flooding Europe. So nobody wants that to happen.
Thank you for sharing those insights. I want to get in a few more participant questions before we run out of time. Blaise, for you, what can the SDF realistically do, if anything, to counter the drone campaign? Or is this wholly dependent on diplomatic pressure from the United States or others to, you know, perhaps withhold weapons sales like the F-16s? What are your thoughts on how to tamper down the drone attacks?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. You know, I think the U.S. does have some ability to actually control the airspace over northeast Syria, together with the Russians at least. We've seen Turkey have to use deconfliction mechanisms with both Russia and the U.S. in order to fly in that airspace. So I think you know, short of imposing a no-fly zone, the U.S. can certainly put up cap combat air patrols. It can try to monitor the airspace and make it more difficult for Turkish drones to operate there. If it were to choose to do so, that might require putting in place more and different assets than it currently uses. It might require some friction with the Turks that we might not be willing to contemplate right now. But more importantly, it would require getting air assets over northeast Syria that would have to come from someplace other than Incirlik, our main air base in the region, because obviously that's in Turkey. And as we've seen, the Turks can shut down U.S. operations there when they don't like what we're doing, which I think highlights once again, one of the major pathologies of the U.S.-Turkish relationship, which is that Turkey thinks it's more important to us than it is, and we seem to acquiesce and allow Turkey to use leverage like Incirlik to define U.S. actions. So I think there's certainly actions that we could take to try to keep Turkey from operating its drones in northeast Syrian airspace. But it would require taking some difficult political decisions, which I'm not sure we're ready to take.
Could I also jump in here with the sort of inbuilt contradiction to all of this U.S. policy, which is, they help Turkey when it's attacking the PKK in Iraqi Kurdistan. I don't know if they still provide real-time intelligence. Everyone says they don't since the October 2019 invasion, but the fact remains that they're on the same page with Turkey when it comes to the PKK. So this all goes back to the, Turkey's Kurdish issue and the fact that, until this is addressed politically, you're always going to have these repercussions, be it in the Syrian theater, the Iraqi theater. What needs to happen is that the peace process be resumed within Turkey between, the HDP and the Öcalan-led movement and the Turkish state.
A similarly difficult international policy question for both of you. Have either of you seen any movement between policymakers on how to address the ISIS prisoners that remain in Syria and whether or not their home countries will ever take those prisoners back, or where, if not, where do they go if not just being a remaining threat within Syria?
Amberin, any thoughts based
well,
on?
There was, the UK, where I'm presently based, is passing this new law that basically allows them to strip people of citizenship in ways that are like just totally in defiance of any international humanitarian norms. So clearly, the position is not shifting. Is not. I think that the way European countries see this is that they're setting an example through their, intransigence on this issue, not taking back the parents, certainly, but maybe just the kids. That seems to be, that's not going to change, I think. They just don't want those people back here. That's what I see, but maybe you have a different take on it.
I haven't seen anything to suggest there's any desire or movement to do anything about the prisoners, unfortunately. Okay.
Well, before again we run out of time, I wanted to get one more set of participant questions in, and this question is for Amberin. One of our participants is asking about the Christians in northeast Syria, and are you seeing just that there's nowhere left for them to go, or how strongly has the water issue impacted just that population fleeing the region?
Well, it was initially ISIS that impacted them. They fled, as ISIS moved into their areas. But what I can say is that, if there's anywhere they can feel safe in Syria, it would be the northeast, definitely. Okay, it's not Sweden, but there is a concerted effort, I think, to sort of create a more multicultural, multi-ethnic, pluralistic, democratic kind of culture there, for sure. And however much, people are trying to leave, etc., the economy is in a terrible state. I have to say, and I wish I said sooner, is that each time I go, I see progress. I see real progress. I see the administration there really institutionalizing in a way that, does project, I know it sounds contradictory, it sounds like a bit of a paradox, but stability. And I think, just speaking to people who weren't pro-YPG, just anyone, they all said that they certainly felt safer in that area, and these are Arabs, for instance, than they would anywhere else in Syria. And, the NGOs there, the money that's coming from the United States, USAID, all of that, it's obviously not enough, and there should be much more. But it has created a kind of an economy there. So, for instance, in Kamishli, I went to a cafe, I had a delicious frappuccino. You saw young people sitting in the cafe chatting, and then on the streets at night, young women. Oh, in Raqqa, I was in Naim Square, where the public beheadings were taking place under the Islamic State. Right in the middle, I saw young women uncovered at night, sitting, chatting. Restaurants were open. People were, in the restaurants eating. There was the one image that will never leave me is this guy with balloons, huge red heart-shaped balloons that said "I love you" on them. I mean, all of those things give you hope. Definitely give you hope. And for instance, for those who can afford it, you can have Toblerone chocolates, you can have Oreo cookies. The supermarkets there are quite well stocked, and I definitely recommend to all the women who use eyeliner to buy the eyeliner that's sold there. It's really great. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing such a personal and excellent insider view into what you've seen through your travels. Will you be going back anytime soon, or?
I hope so, yes. I very much hope so, yes.
And Blaise, do you have any final thoughts before our session wraps up?
I'm perfectly content to end on that very hopeful note that we heard from Amberin.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank all of our participants today, and thank you to the Syrian Democratic Council for inviting me to be a moderator for this event, and hope to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Tara.
Thank you so much for.
Thank you, Tara.
Thank you so much, Amberin. Thank you so much, Blaise and Tara. And really, it's very good perceptions, and whatever you see in the region, it gives us hope also.
Oh, you should have hope.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And I didn't say much more because I'm saving it for my stories, but I have some great stories of hope that I'll now be relaying.
Oh, thank you so much.
About people who are coming back from Europe to give back to their society and doing amazing things.
Yeah. And we are always, we don't lose our hope. We are always optimistic, and to build a new Syria, decentralized Syria, democratic Syria, pluralistic, based on gender equality and on religious freedom and democracy. This is what we need actually for the future of Syria. Thank you so much, Blaise, for your participation today. It's really very honored to have you today. Thank you, Tara, for moderating. And we hope to see you, maybe Tara and Blaise, again in the Northeast Syria. You are always welcome. We are inviting you to be there. Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a good day for all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.